Hi, John.
Hello.
Great to have you here in Helsinki during Slush. Second day is over now. And besides startups, we talked a lot about corporates and how they perform and how they do in terms of corporate innovation and innovation models, creating new business models and also involving startups into that process. From your point of view, how do you think corporates are performing in terms of behaving like a startup or trying to behave as a startup at the moment? And is it maybe even the wrong way to think that you have to adopt all those startup attitudes to become more innovative?
So how are corporates as a class behaving? And I would say they're doing everything, right? Some are going left, some are going right, some are going up, some are going down. But the fundamental question is, at the rate the world is changing right now, you can either be part of the innovation of that change, or you can suffer the consequences of being second to that change. So I think that all corporations need to have some kind of innovation methodology. And there's a bunch that have different ones. So it used to be that you would do it all in-house and you have R&D and you would pay for that, and then it would cherry pick some things out of that and it would move something forward. But that wasn't a very effective process. My experience with R&D was we rarely saw things from the corporate R&D, and there was a big R, little d development at the corporate headquarters, and then there was a little r, capital D development at our local place. 90% of our projects died on the vine, right? But it was without customer engagement. So the fundamental thing that the lean startup methodology has brought to the conversation is this notion of not wasting your time on things that don't matter, and the thing that matters most after you know that it's possible to build the thing is, does anybody want it? So customer development is vital. And I want to be a little definitional. We talk about startups, and the press uses startups to cover anything that's interesting because startups are interesting, and therefore anything that's a business is a startup. But I want to use it in a specific way. In the beginning, you have no business. You have an idea, and you want to prove that you have a business, and to prove you have a business, you have to get customers. So if you look at that lovely exponential curve that we see in our business pitches at angel conferences, the place where you're a business is probably at the place where you have product market fit, which is the inflection point on that curve. So there's a whole bunch of work that happens before that inflection point. So before you have product market fit, I will call you a startup. And after you have product market fit, you're a business. And those are two different problems. So in so much as a corporation has an idea and wants to prove that there's a business, it will benefit from the task of thinking like standalone startups, which is to do customer development early, to be very conservative about how you spend your energy, and to focus on the things that are important, and to do lots of little experiments that you can afford to lose, and then to discover some form of product market fit.
I think when you look at how people look at startups, they always just see the big successes like Facebook, Amazon, Google, all the other Spotify, and they call those startups, and they don't really realize that there are so many startups that are not successful at all.
Right. So in the United States, we have 500,000 businesses started each year, and we have what, $126 billion plus companies in the world. So, you know, divide 126 by 500,000 times 10 years, and that's a really close to zero, right? So they talk about the exception.
Yeah, and they always try to become like them, and but they only look on the surface, like they want to be.
So the thing that they seem to miss a little bit of is the history of a project after it matures. So 9 out of 10 startups that exit because they have been acquired. And so that's actually an innovation strategy, right? I'm going to, as a corporation, not invest a lot in innovation, or I'm going to have an R&D that sort of keeps me aware, but I'm not going to expect them to do the product development work. I'm going to let the startup do the product development work, and then when somebody gets interesting, I'll just buy them, right? And so we see that happening a lot. That's why over the last 20 years, we've seen a significant growth in corporate venture arms that are basically funding their R&D through purchases. It works. The thing that's not effective about it is it doesn't necessarily make you the leader. And a lot of times when you bring it in, there's a whole arc on the other side of how do you take that project that was working as a business of its own into the next level of a bigger business unit inside the big thing, which has some kind of coherence and still produces cash at the rate that they need, right? So that's its own arc, right? But on the other hand, internally, if you are experimenting with ideas and customer development in your R&D program, that's a very useful skill, right? Doing the iteration, working on the experiments and driving that forward. And then there gets to be a point where you have some internal trouble inside the organization because the thing that looks like R&D ends up looking like waste to the production side of the house. And so if you spend too much on R&D, then there's a reset in the budget next year, and all of a sudden that budget went over to this side, and then that project dies, right? So there's an opportunity to figure out how to marry this startup conversation with the corporate conversation in some form of partnership, right? Some outside person has an idea, they get it up and working, it has a reasonable run rate and a reasonable growth rate, and then it gets purchased and brought inside. What do you do with the guy inside the company who has an idea that's very interesting, and instead of just a manager killing it because he's stealing the budget from the R&D department, how do you get that to run its experiment? And some corporations are doing that internally. And so when you read Eric Ries's book about the guide to doing lean startup inside large companies, he talks a lot about GE and how GE is putting programs together internally to make that happen and trying to drive that innovation idea across the whole corporation. They're trying to make the whole entity innovative in some way, right? Keep improving things in a way. So they're trying to manage that process all internal. On the other hand, there is a GE Ventures program, and they do go buy things, and so it goes both ways.
In Germany, we see a lot of corporations buying startups that are sometimes even quite big. We saw startups with around 150 to 200 employees, for example, in the Munich area, bought by some big corporation. And what we saw a lot in the past is that corporations buy those startups. After a couple of months, the initial founders leave the company, and we see a total shift, a total bad development in terms of corporate culture within those startups. They at some point in time behave like a corporate. They become slow. They have so many processes. It becomes really difficult to stay so agile and fast in terms of innovation as they've been before they got bought.
They probably shouldn't stay as agile as they were at the beginning. Processes aren't bad, as a basis. They're not bad just because they're processes. The more you want to make a process efficient, the more you want to hone in on doing certain things well. You can get some great financial benefits from that, right? You keep price reducing your product and improving it, and that thing that was $30 that had a 10% margin now is $15 and has a 90% margin, and you pull lots and lots of cash. But then you run straight into the innovator's dilemma, right? Where you have this thing, it's very profitable, it doesn't cost you very much to do, everybody knows their job. You go from 50 employees working on that project to 5 people working on that project because you've optimized it, and then the world changes. And then that product, you know, drops off in its sales dramatically, and then nobody knows what to do because they weren't prepared for the next generation, right? The hard part is that the rate of change is getting faster and faster. And so placing those large-scale bets have a substantially greater risk over time because the opportunity for someone to come along with something that disrupts them is getting higher. So I would say that corporations have to be making smaller, shorter bets than they used to. But when you can find a niche where you can protect it in some way and carry it for several years, that's typically the piece that produces lots of revenue that allows you to make other investments other places. So if you look at the S curve as you adopt from idea to I have an idea that's got product market fit to things are running reasonably well and we're growing fast to we're slowing down, so we've 50% of the market has adopted our product and now we're on to the second 50%. Everything starts slowing down and slowing down. That's a perfect place for process optimization. So doing that up there is just fine. The problem is those habits get transplanted into those new employees in about 3 to 8 weeks, and all of a sudden they're adopting these optimization behaviors when they still haven't hit the middle of the market, and that wastes a lot of the market for that company. But there's room in the corporate structure to put things in place that deal with the first half of that curve. And sometimes you even have to put things in place which have institutional barriers around them so that you can't have rearrangement of priorities by other parts of the company. So there's a guy named Trevor Owens who's done some work with an idea called innovation colonies, where you actually take ideas out of the corporation, spin it out into a separate company, and then drive that process. So work through it, have employees that are committed to that process, have a budget that's isolated from the mothership budget, but have an ownership stake and have a right of, like, first right of refusal for purchasing it and bringing it back in. If that company gets to an interesting turning point, it can get brought back in as a component, or it can go off the other way and go IPO and do its own thing.
Do you have an example for a corporation that is doing that quite good already?
But so the thing that I thought was particularly interesting is to look, I don't have a good one which is sort of intentionally doing this as a strategy. Mm-hmm. I know that there are people who have been working on this question on the East Coast of the United States, but I haven't seen any in my area. But there is a company called Tektronix that was in Portland, and if you look at the number of small companies that came out of the Tektronix process, it was just tremendous. Hundreds of companies where a couple of engineers would take an idea that wasn't being sponsored internally in the way that was going to make it successful, and they took that idea and they started a company and they produced another company and off it went. And so there's really quite a few pieces of the Portland ecosystem that are a result of half of that cycle. The thing that Tektronix didn't have was a implicit mechanism to bring them back in, and so sometimes they acquired them, sometimes they didn't, but that was sort of a ad hoc thing. And I think you can get a little more formal about it, make it a little bit more of a process of its own, where people feel safer doing that, and people have an opportunity to drive more experiments that are bigger, that then feed back into the corporation. So in Germany, they probably don't do this as much, but in the United States, there's business cycles, and when the business cycle goes down, typically there's some fat in the business that gets trimmed, which is usually first or second tier managers, and some of the older engineers all get given an opportunity to be doing something else. So we fire people, give them a retirement bonus or whatever, but we could have taken that same amount of energy and put that into a startup and have them spin out that startup and work on the thing that they're already passionately in love with in their R&D program, and then have them have a business already built, have them moving forward, and the opportunity for both the individual and the company to benefit seems pretty high. I know that there are people who have been talking about this. I would love to find some that have implemented it as policy.
Okay. So in the end, startups can learn a lot from corporates, and corporates a lot from startups.
Absolutely.
What if you, maybe as a final statement, when you look at maybe 3 things a corporation can learn from a startup, and maybe 3 things a startup can learn from a corporation, what would come to your mind?
So from an economic development point of view, which is the way that I think about startups a lot, the economic development place where there's a lot of energy is in a stage 2 company, from a company that's 10 employees to 100 employees. So there's several changes in the company itself that are fundamental, that if you can't navigate those changes, you blow your company up. So the first cycle, where you get up to 10 employees, it's pretty easy to do with a couple of guys and a personality. But that second piece is really tricky. So typically, we're seeing that companies get bought somewhere between the 20 and the 50 million range. So we'll talk about that arc, right? So companies can learn how to do small tests, small innovation tests, and do build, measure, learn kinds of activities. They can learn how to do customer development, where they're actually going out and talking to real customers. I've worked with corporations where the idea of going downstairs to the front door of the business and talking to the business people coming in and using their services was like, we can't do that. That it's just very strange that there's a hesitation to talk to the customers, but there's 3 layers of people between the people building the product and the people talking to the customers, and you need to remove those. Yeah. And I think the whole notion of learning how to talk a narrative about your product, about the problem before you build the product, is an important skill that all startups need, and which corporations need to figure out too, because the notion of telling a narrative in a meaningful way about where we're going can really transform their internal processes as well as people's understanding of them. From a startup point of view, as you go through that stage 2, somewhere around 24 employees, you need an HR person. Somewhere around 50 employees, you need a whole collection of processes that don't exist in most startups. Somewhere around 75 employees, you have to figure out how to manage by policy. And so large corporations understand how to manage by policy. Startups have no policies. And so somehow you got to get from no policy to functional policy and live through the process of making that change. So I think there's substantial opportunity to help that transition, to learn pieces of that transition. One of the things that corporations can do for startups is startups typically are at a significant disadvantage around talking to customers, because they don't have any customers. They have no customer list, but the corporation has customers that are already spending money with them, and they already have a entree into having a conversation with those people. So if they can make introductions to customers, and if the startups can learn how to ask for those introductions in a reasonable and safe way for the corporation, that's really a useful skill.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Glad to do this.